Today, the update has the pleasure of interviewing Orlando Figes, a history professor at Birkbeck College. He graduated from Cambridge University and went on to write critically acclaimed books such as A People's Tragedy, The Russian Revolution from 1891 to 1924. He's received a number of awards for his works, such as the Wolfson Prize, the NCR Book Award, the W.H. Smith Literary Award, the Longman History Today Book Prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. His books have been translated into 20 languages, and he is now one of the world's leading experts on Russian history. Orlando, thank you for being with us. We're here almost 100 years to the day. What do you think we've learned from the Russian Revolution?
It depends who the we is, I suppose. I think in the West people have learned a lot. There's been lots of history books. People have had time to consider it with all the information that they need, I guess, because there's open discussion. There's been a frank revelation of all the archives, and the historians have been free to debate it. I think in Russia, if it's the we we're talking about are Russians, it's a slightly different situation because, as I want to stress in my talk tomorrow, what the Russians have lived with for 100 years is the myth of the revolution. The myth is peddled by the Soviets, and then the post-Soviet myths, which are also myths which are not necessarily as revelatory about the truth of the revolution or about some truth of the revolution that can be discussed, that will teach lessons in that way. So I think Russia has a long way to go still in terms of coming to terms with the violent legacies of the revolution and learning the lessons from that.
What connections do you see with Russia's past and its present?
Oh, a lot. I think Russia's still very much in the shadow of the revolution. Not in the sense that it's still a revolutionary society or anything like that, but in the sense that the legacies of the revolution are still in attitudes, in modes of behaviour among Russians, in attitudes particularly towards power, towards the state. I think, for example, there was a poll taken in 2007 which showed that 2/3 of the population in 3 cities who were asked thought that the Cheka, which was the sort of foundation of the KGB, Lenin's political police, had protected society like a normal police force would. And even though they knew that 10 to 20 million innocent people had been killed by the NKVD, as the Cheka came to be known under Stalin, they still thought, nonetheless, it had protected society. So that's an attitude I don't think you would find in most societies that hadn't gone through that sort of experience. But it does show that in Russia, where they've had that experience, and also all those years of silencing the population about the terror carried out by the state, particularly under Stalin, it's created a sort of acquiescence of a large section of the population, acquiescence and acceptance of state violence for goals that are perceived as good, perhaps. So I think for the same reason you could draw a connection between that sort of attitude and the popular support for the invasion of Crimea, for example. Not enough people have questioned it, because the state says that's a goal that Russia needs and is justifiable, and justifies the ends of the invasion of another country. So those are just 2 examples, but I think there are many more which show that Russia's still living with the consequences, the sort of consequences in terms of psyche, in terms of mentalities that were left behind from the wreckage of the Soviet system.
So as you said, there seems to be an acquiescence of violence from the state. Then do you see any connections with a possible future of Russia?
Not in a directly threatening way, no. I think that Russians are tired of revolutions. They're tired of civil wars. They're tired of being asked to make sacrifice for the state in a way that could make it an aggressive military threat. I don't see Russia as an aggressive military threat even though obviously they did invade Ukraine to annex Crimea. I think there are particular reasons for that, which the Russians see as justifiable. Crimea always was Russia, etc. I don't think that condones it for 1 second, but I think that it suggests we should see the Crimea situation as slightly separate from any potential threat to, say, the Baltic states or any other neighbouring state. I think what Russia wants is certainly to assert its interest in what it thinks of as a sphere of influence, another hangover from Soviet days. In other words, that just as America has its sphere of influence in Central America, say, so why shouldn't Russia have its sphere of influence in the former territories of the Soviet Union? So it feels that Ukraine is its sphere of influence, and it, I think, regrets the loss of that because of the revolution, and also is afraid of revolution in Russia itself coming possibly from Ukraine. So that makes it a rather defensive country, a little bit hostile to the West in the sense that it sees it as a potential enemy, but it's in a defensive mode. I would characterize Russia as being in an aggressive mode of defensiveness, but not in an ambitious, expansive mode.
How do you think Russians should commemorate the revolution and indeed the Romanov dynasty?
Well, how they should commemorate it is up to them. It's not for some foreign historian to tell them how to do it. I think it will be a very low-key event, certainly no official line on it. And that's because the last thing Putin wants to encourage is any Russians to start thinking about revolution or to dwell on the potential of revolution, the possibilities of 1917. And it's also, I think, because it's a very divisive issue. There are still supporters of the communists, there are still people who look back to the Soviet Union as, you know, a great civilization and the revolution as the beginning of that, and then there are others who see it as a catastrophe, the moment when Russia was destroyed as a great power, particularly those on the side of the monarchists. So it's divisive, and for that reason I don't think Russians have properly come to terms with it. And how do they do that? I think they can only begin to do that when they grapple properly with the history, when they have an open discussion about it and move away from the myths of the revolution that they've lived with all this time.
What myths of revolution specifically are you talking about?
I guess, you know, there's the myth that 1917, October in particular, was a great October Socialist Revolution, as it was called in the Soviet Union, and was a mass event rather than a coup. And that element of myth-making has allowed those, not just necessarily communists, but even those who maybe support Putin from a different perspective, to roll everything from the Soviet era into the post-Soviet era, particularly Putin, so that Putin represents the culmination of everything that went before. In other words, Lenin was the beginning of a civilization. It had great achievements, industrialization, the defeat of Nazism above all, Soviet science and technology, and this is part of what makes Russia great. Yeah? It made mistakes, but we don't need to dwell on them, and Putin is the inheritor of that. That's the sort of Russia is great scenario that is rooted in the myth of October as a great revolution. Whereas if you begin to unpack that myth and look at the real consequences of the revolution's violence in terms of the people it destroyed, in terms of the values it changed, in terms of what it led to in consequence, Stalinism, collectivization, the mass terror and so on, then that requires a complete reevaluation of Russia's history in a way that would possibly begin to question the idea of what Putin stands for, the idea of what a great Russia means. So that's a particularly problematic myth. I guess the other myth, which is very dangerous at the moment and is on the rise, is the right-wing or monarchist myth, which is that the revolution was not really a Russian thing. It was carried out by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who were agents of the Germans because they were sent back to Russia by the Germans in the war. who were most of them Jews. So it was like a foreign imposition on Russia by agents working for a foreign power who were Jews. It was a Jewish conspiracy. This is gaining ground, this idea that, you know, the Marxism of the revolution is not something in the Russian nature, it was something imported into Russia by the enemies of Russia in order to destroy it. That sort of idea is very poisonous and unfortunately gaining some ground in Russia at the moment.
Were you always interested in history as a boy? Did you have a favorite book or a special teacher that provoked your interest?
No, I wasn't always interested in history as a boy. I guess I wasn't particularly interested in any sort of academic discipline, like most boys, I guess. I mean, I love reading literature. My mother was a writer, and I guess that slightly intimidated me, and I thought I wasn't sort of good enough to be like her, or didn't quite have the talent perhaps to study literature, although I love reading. The first moment I really thought maybe history's for me is, I remember must have been about 15 or actually, maybe I was a bit older than that. Maybe I was 16 or 17. I can't remember whether it was for O-levels, GCSEs as we call them, or A-levels, what your IB would be. But we had a history teacher who read history out of a book that he must have written when he first started teaching, you know, an exercise book. And it was a very simple narrative, and it was pretty dull. But then he got to one moment where he talked about the Great Stink of 1858, which was a moment in London's history when Parliament was literally confronted with the problem of sewage, because it was ending up on the embankment of the Thames outside the Houses of Parliament. And that year, 1858, there was a drought, a very hot summer, and so it got very smelly. And so they decided that they had to build sewers to stop people just flushing their sewage into the Thames and let it drift downriver. And this coincided with the awareness that actually cholera and other diseases were waterborne, so it would be good for public health to have a proper sewage system. And so my first historic hero, if you like, was Basil Jett, who was an Italian immigrant to London, who built the London sewage system. And for me it had a particular resonance because I had an uncle who worked in the sewers. And I suddenly realised what an important job this man did. And I think what that did for me is it just showed how there were so many connections in history. There's the awareness of public health and cholera and medicine, and there was the problem of how does things that are important really get changed, or does it take a great stink for politicians to actually want to do something about it? It opened up the whole sort of archaeology of London, the city I grew up in, so it was interesting. And I guess it sort of was a way into social history. It told me how ordinary people lived.
Other than revolutionary Russia, what's another section of history that you're interested in?
Oh, I'm interested in all sorts of areas of history, and I read widely in history. I think, you know, if you're interested in one area of history, you don't really know it until you know other histories or histories of other countries. At the moment, I'm doing a book which I've been working on for a very long time, and will come out, I hope, in a couple of years, which is it's a history of 19th century European culture, but it's looking at the impact of, I suppose you could call it capitalism in a way. It's looking at the impact of the money, of the market, of the new mechanisms that artists had for earning money in the market, looking at the impact of that on the development of European culture. So it's looking at why it is really that certain books, operas, pieces of music and books, you know, how they spread across Europe. And I think that what makes them spread across Europe are the market laws at work, and technological inventions like lithography, which revolutionized publishing, new ideas about copyright, which enabled a standard form to be distributed and enabled artists to make money out of their work because they could charge a royalty on it. It was about the railways and new means of mass communication. There are all sorts of things going on which help to spread culture across boundaries.
As a historian, looking at such brutal times, especially when you were combing through the archives, Did you lose faith in humanity or make you doubt whether humans were capable of good?
Oh, no, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer it. I don't think I ever doubted human beings were capable of good. Even the darkest book I've written, which is The Whisperers, which is based on a big oral history project about private life in the Stalin period, and is full of stories of grim brutality, cruelty, malice, people denouncing friends and colleagues because they're frightened of being denounced by them. This madness that ensued in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. There's some pretty terrible stories. There's some pretty dark sides of humanity that come out from that. But at the same time, there was always just enough, and it is, I think, probably just enough stories of human kindness, of people helping strangers, people going out their way, sometimes at great risk, to rescue people, to save one's view of humanity. I mean, and so there are some heroes in that book. I mean, school teachers, actually. I mean, you're in a school, you have to pay credit to your teachers. And in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, there were many school teachers who, being intelligent, educated people, saw through what the Bolsheviks were doing, what Stalin was doing, denouncing enemies of the people. And they understood that the children of these people were completely innocent, and their parents possibly innocent. And rather than turn them over to orphanages or let them roam the streets to be arrested themselves, they helped them. They paid their school fees because at around that time the Soviet system started charging children for school fees, which is amazing in a socialist state, but it's true. And some of them even sort of helped them against schoolmates who would sort of denounce them because they knew their parents had been arrested, and the teachers would protect them. So this was, could be at personal risk. So there are always stories like that I think rescue your view of humanity. But as you say, Soviet history is full of rather dark stories.
Do you think that by studying history, people can avoid making previous mistakes and avoiding, say, totalitarian regimes?
Well, you'd like to think so. But I don't think, even if there are lessons of history, I don't think people tend to learn them. We tend to keep repeating the same mistakes. As Marx said of Napoleon, the first time it's tragedy, the second it's comedy, or farce. I don't know if he was referring to Napoleon III there, but I think it's true that history does repeat itself. People do repeat the same mistakes. I think we're in danger at the moment of repeating some of the mistakes of the 1930s. We're seeing the rise of populist demagogues in Trump, for example. If we don't read our history, if we don't engage with the history of where we've been not so far ago, we're in danger of sinking further into that morass of allowing lies to dictate our politics, of letting our emotions and what we want to believe to be true. And of course, we need history to teach us what's true or not. So it's not that we necessarily learn the lessons of the past and correct them the second time around, but history, I think, is a lesson in the sense that it enables us to engage with the argument about what is true or not. And it helps us to think critically about what we receive as information.
So do you think that your role as a historian is therefore to warn people about the pitfalls of having a regime or powers concentrated in one person amongst other predictable mistakes?
Yeah, I'm always shying away from that idea of a warning. Historians aren't prophets, and they're not there really to give warnings. I think it's up to the reader to read the warnings if they want to. It's up to us as historians, or I see my task as historians, just to put it out there as it is, really, as I see it. I don't think I've ever written a book with a warning. This book comes with a warning. Repeat the mistakes therein at your peril, sort of thing. No, it's a bit didactic, isn't it? It's a bit like trying to teach lessons when actually I don't think history works like that. I think it's about stories, and people learn the lessons they want from the stories. And it's probably counterproductive to issue warnings. So I think I prefer to keep it as inference, maybe. But my view on something is an inference that people pick up.
Does having controversial points of view that other historians don't always necessarily agree with, does it feel alienating?
No, well, any view worth having is probably controversial, because any view that is original is going to stand out in some way from what is orthodox or commonplace. So if you don't want to have enemies or people criticise you, then just repeat what's been said a million times before, and everyone will agree with you. But you won't be saying anything new. If you have something new to say, or a new way of saying something, or a new angle on something, or you have strong opinions on something, then you should have the courage to say it. Whether that's a book or whether that's a student essay. I think that's what gives you voice as a historian. And the consequences of that are that you may get criticised, but at least you'll have your view. And I think that's a good tip for writing essays, by the way. I think that I've always encouraged my students to have an argument which is really what they think, and has been arrived at as a series of judgments. They've made some judgments, and they've concluded something from these judgments, and they're putting forward that argument in as balanced a way as they can, bearing in mind all the different evidence that they could bring to the argument, but with their point of view. And I think it's no different for you writing an essay like that as it is for me writing a book like that. It's the same thing. But yes, you need the courage of your convictions, and you need to know that that will possibly make you controversial.
For an event as complex as the Russian Revolution, do you think that one account can be definitive?
No, of course not. There's no such thing as the definitive history. I mean, I no doubt, it's been put on many book covers by their publishers, but not necessarily claimed by the historian. No historian worth their salt would claim their history to be the definitive. Only the publishers do that as a marketing device. So why can there not be a definitive history? Because history is in constant flux, by which I mean history writing. What history is made of in books, articles, and so on. And it's in constant flux because perspective always changes. The nature of the evidence we have is always changing, even if it's a very long ago subject. There's always new things coming to light. There's always new ways of looking at things, and history is always informed by the culture of the time. A big event may happen which may force us to think again about something that has significance for that debate about what makes humans act in the way they do. Yeah? So a war may come along, or something may happen that throws open questions about what makes for a dictatorship, or what makes for conformity with a dictatorship, or what makes for people to be racist, or what makes for wars to happen. Our understanding of how these big things happen is changing all the time in the light of what we see around us and how we react to current events. So there can be no definitive account for that reason, but also more fundamentally there can be no definitive history because history is only an interpretation. History isn't there are facts for sure, but history is an interpretation of the facts that a historian mobilizes to make an argument. And there can be a different emphasis, a different selection of facts, a different perspective, a different approach altogether, a different set of assumptions. And all of these things will make a different interpretation. And some are better than others, some more persuasive than others, but none is definitive.
So in the way that you said that history has to more give an account as opposed to warn, do you think that historians can ever get close to what we would call like an ultimate truth and give a very honest and objective account? Or do you think there will always be a bias or the victory side giving its own version of history?
That's a great question. I guess, your last point is the important place, perhaps always to bear in mind. It is the history of victors, isn't it? But I think, in the last generation or so, there's been a lot of history about the losers too. My own first book was about the Russian peasants, and they were big-time losers of the Russian Revolution. And others have studied, you know, the subaltern classes, as they're sometimes called, or they've looked at minorities, or they've looked at slaves, or they've looked at women in certain periods of history when women have been marginalised. You know, that's being reversed now, and there's a better balance on that. There'll always be biases, of course, as I've said. Will there be an ultimate history? No, I don't think so, for the same reasons there'll be no definitive history. But history, the process by which historical interpretation develops, sure, it's a conversation, it's an engagement with other historians, with the public, and I suppose some things become accepted truths, or some things become unacceptable as ideas in explaining historical events. So there is never an end point, but there's a sort of direction in which a mainstream perhaps goes. And coming back to your earlier point about controversy, sometimes it's the original people who were controversial at that time, you know, maybe after their death even, who become then sort of accepted and part of the mainstream, because their ideas take some time to enter into that mainstream and to be worked upon by those who take those ideas on.